I still remember the way the rain soaked through my uniform that night when the radio crackled with a young private's voice. It was thin and unsure, but the words froze my blood. He said he had heard something near the old East bunker. That place had been abandoned for years, nothing but a slab of wet concrete on the far edge of Fort Liberty, a place no one was supposed to enter. I drove through the rain wipers, struggling, and when I reached the hatch, the night air felt heavier than the storm. The sound came again. A faint whimper, small, fragile human. I forced the rusted hatch open and climbed down the narrow steps with my flashlight shaking in my hand. The damp air smelled like cold steel and forgotten fear. The beam of light landed on a tiny shape on the floor, a soaked pink pajama sleeve, a small hand. My heart stopped. Ava, my 2-year-old daughter. My knees hit the concrete before I even felt them. She was curled on her side lips, pale, soaked through wide eyes, staring past me silent. She did not cry. She did not make a sound. When I touched her shoulder, her skin was cold enough to burn. I pulled her to my chest, wrapping her in my jacket, feeling how shallow her breaths were. She was alive, but fading. The rain hammered harder above as I carried her out of that hole. Military police lights cut through the darkness. One MP ran toward me, but I held Ava tighter. She was mine, and I was not letting go. The senior investigator bent down and saw the old army blanket around her. Its edges were frayed, but a clean, straight line across the seam made my stomach twist. Someone had cut it. Someone had planned this. Captain Hale stepped out of a black SUV, rain sliding off his hood. His voice was steady, too steady. He said there was no need to make this public, that it would be handled internally. The words dropped like ice into my chest. My child had been left in a bunker, and they wanted silence. One MP checked the security system. Camera footage stopped at 1900 hours. Hale gave him a look, and the young soldier shut up. Someone had disabled the feed. Someone with access. Ava's body trembled against me. She still did not make a sound. Her tiny fingers clutched my collar. I whispered her name, but nothing came back. I scanned the faces around me. Not one of them looked surprised. Concern, yes, but no surprise. That terrified me more than the bunker itself. I carried my daughter past the line of flashlights toward the Jeep. A medic reached for her, but I didn't let go right away. The last time I had trusted the system, she had been taken from me. I lowered her into their arms only when I saw her chest rising beneath the thermal blanket. The medic said she was suffering from hypothermia and dehydration. He said she was lucky. I bit down on that word. Lucky is not what you call a child abandoned in the dark. Hale leaned closer and warned me not to speak about this. His tone was smooth, rehearsed, meant to control. My heart beat so loud I could hear it over the storm. The bunker behind me looked like an open wound in the ground. My flashlight still lay at the bottom of the steps where I had dropped it. I imagined what would have happened if no one had heard her. I didn't finish that thought. As they carried Ava toward the ambulance, she turned her head slightly, lips pressed together, eyes blank. Silent. Something inside me hardened. The MP pulled the hatch closed with a sound like a cell door. Rain kept falling. Somewhere deep inside me, a line had been crossed. I watched Hale whisper to the investigator and caught the glance they threw my way. This was not random. This was power. And if they thought fear would keep me quiet, they had chosen the wrong woman. I climbed into the back of the ambulance and took Ava's tiny hand in mine. Her skin was still cold but warming. The door slammed shut. Sirens cut through the night. I made a promise without saying a word. I would find who did this. I would tear through their silence layer by layer, and when the truth came out, it would not be whispered. It would be heard by every single person on this base. If you were me, what would you do if you found your child in a place no one should ever be? Would you keep quiet like they wanted, or would you fight? Tell me. 2 years ago, I was still wearing the same uniform, but I was not the woman who stood in the rain that night. Back then, I believed that if I followed the rules, the system would protect me. I believed that if I showed up to court in pressed dress blues and spoke carefully, they would hear me. That was before Ethan Kane ripped the ground out from under me. Ethan had worn the same uniform, carried the same rank, smiled in the same hallways. He came from one of those families that grew roots deep into every corner of the base. His father, Colonel Richard Kane, had retired 5 years earlier, but his shadow still stretched across Fort Liberty. He knew every officer with power, every board member with a vote. Ethan didn't win the custody battle because he was a better father. He won because his name weighed more than mine on every piece of paper. On the day the court order was read, I stood in the back of the small military courtroom with my hands folded so tightly the nails cut into my skin. Ethan didn't even look at me. Vivian Kane, his mother, sat in the first row, chin lifted, wearing a cream jacket and a smile that didn't touch her eyes. The judge spoke quickly, a voice of authority without warmth, declaring that primary custody would go to Ethan Kane. I could visit twice a month and on alternating weekends. That was it. My daughter would live under their roof. She would call their house home. I remember walking out into the parking lot afterward, the sun too bright, my hands trembling around the paper I was supposed to sign. Vivian walked past me with that same smooth glide she always had, like she owned the air around her. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. She had already won. Ethan was deployed 3 months after the divorce, but nothing changed. In fact, it got worse. Vivian became the gatekeeper of Ava's world. I would call and she would say the timing was inconvenient. I would drive to the house in Fayetteville and she would keep the door shut while my daughter cried inside. I will never forget one night in particular. I stood on the wooden porch of that house, rain drizzling just enough to make the wood slick under my boots. Through the window, I could hear Ava crying, that desperate hiccuping cry toddlers make when they don't understand why the person they want isn't there. I knocked once. Vivian opened the door just enough to let her perfume and her power seep out. She said Ethan was overseas, that the house was on a schedule, that I should respect it. She didn't invite me in. She didn't even look down at the small backpack I had packed for Ava. She closed the door slowly, deliberately, like punctuation at the end of a sentence. I drove back to the barracks that night with the sound of Ava's crying still ringing in my ears. I stared at the steering wheel so long my hands cramped. That was the night I started writing everything down. Every missed call. Every time Vivian refused a visit, every message she didn't return. I built a file not out of hope, but out of quiet fury. I knew I couldn't outmaneuver their last name in a courtroom. Richard Kane still played golf with half the legal officers on base. But I could wait. I could document, and I could remember. When I filed for an emergency modification of visitation 6 months later, the hearing lasted less than 15 minutes. Ethan's lawyer was a man who had been a JAG officer for 20 years. He shook hands with the judge before the session started. My lawyer, a woman who had taken my case because she believed in mothers like me, barely got a word in before the motion was denied. Vivian sat behind the table like a queen in court. She didn't even flinch when the judge said there was no evidence of interference. Of course there wasn't. She was too careful for that. No written threats. No messages that could be twisted against her. Just polite refusals and locked doors. I remember walking out of that courtroom again, feeling smaller than the flag flapping above the base gate. I had spent my entire adult life serving following chain of command, respecting rank. And now rank was the thing that kept me from my own child. Ethan would call sometimes from his assignments. He never asked about Ava's day. He asked if I was following the schedule. He asked if I had reported anything. He made it sound like a courtesy, but it was always a warning. I stopped expecting anything from him long before I stopped loving him. The base itself became a kind of cage. Everywhere I went, I saw someone who knew the Kane family. Their name opened doors mine never could. When Vivian walked into the PX, people greeted her like she still carried her husband's rank. When she spoke to the family liaison office, appointments changed. When she called the daycare, rules bent. And through all of it, Ava grew in a house I could not enter without permission. The worst part was that my daughter began to pause at the door when I picked her up. She would cling to my uniform collar, half wanting to stay, half not sure if she was allowed to want me. She was 2, but even at 2, she understood power. She felt it in the way people spoke around her. She felt it in the way Vivian's hand always hovered near her shoulder, claiming her. I would drive her back on Sunday nights and she would press her face into the car seat when we pulled into the driveway. I would carry her to the door. Vivian would open it, and Ava would stop reaching for me. That small gesture cut deeper than any court order. I knew there were fingerprints of influence all over the legal process. The judge was a former colonel. The custody evaluator had once been stationed under Richard Kane. It was all threaded together, invisible but solid. I could not fight it then, not without losing more than I had already lost. So I swallowed it. I let them think I was beaten. I showed up to work on time. I kept my uniform sharp. I played their game. But every locked door, every turned back, every sound of my daughter crying behind those walls became a tally mark on a wall I was building in my head. They believed they had me cornered. They believed my silence was permanent. But I had spent a decade learning discipline, and discipline is what makes some wounds fester into something harder. I watched. I waited, and I remembered every single thing they did, because people like the Kanes believe in power that never ends. They think the system will always bend for them. What they never saw coming was the day their carefully built walls would crack from the inside. And when that day came, I would not be standing outside their door. I would be the one holding the key. The fluorescent lights in the medical ward were too bright and too clean for what had happened. I sat in the chair beside the bed with my wet uniform clinging to my skin, watching Ava breathe. Her tiny chest rose and fell in a rhythm so fragile it made my own lungs ache. The medic had said she was stable, but the word stable felt like a cheap bandage over a wound no one wanted to look at. Her hair was damp against the white pillow, her fingers curled loosely at her sides. She hadn't spoken since I pulled her from the bunker. Not a word. Not even a whisper. She used to talk in her sleep, mumbling about stuffed animals and chocolate milk. Now the silence around her was heavy. The military doctor cleared his throat and went through the findings in that clipped, professional tone they all use when they want to sound objective. Mild dehydration, mild hypothermia, no external injuries, no signs of assault. Estimated time of exposure 4 to 6 hours. Someone had left my daughter underground for half the night. They documented every bruise on my watch, but when it came to this, their language softened. Hypothermia, exposure. Like she had taken a walk into that hole by herself. I signed the medical report with a hand that didn't feel like mine. The ink bled slightly into the paper. Captain Hale appeared in the doorway with that same calm expression he wore at the bunker. He didn't look at Ava. He looked at me. "Sergeant Collins," he said, "I need to be clear. Incidents like this can damage the base's image. There will be an internal review. No statements. No outside reports. Do you understand?" His tone left no room for discussion, but my silence was not agreement. I looked at my daughter's small, pale face and thought about the word image. My child lying in a bunker was bad for the image. Not for her. For them. I nodded once because that was what he expected, but in my head, something shifted again. When he left, I waited for the corridor to clear. Then I walked down the hall to the security office, still dripping rainwater onto the tiles. The watch officer on duty hesitated when he saw me. I outranked him. I didn't need permission. I asked to see the camera logs for the east perimeter. He started to say something about authorization, then I looked him in the eye and he handed over the tablet. The feed cut off at 1900 hours exactly. Every camera around the bunker had gone dark at the same time. That doesn't happen by accident. You need a clearance code, a specific override. Someone had shut the eyes of the base. I scrolled through the access logs for the keycard system. The bunker hadn't been opened officially for years, but it was still wired into the security network. The last access recorded was 4 hours before I found Ava. The name on the log made my stomach tighten. Specialist Jennifer Shaw. She had been one of Ethan's direct subordinates before his transfer. She worked in logistics, a position that gave her entry to restricted areas with the right sign-off. The kind of sign-off that doesn't exist without someone higher up making it possible. Jennifer didn't have the kind of authority needed to kill the camera feed, but she could open the door. I pulled the second layer of the log. There it was, a special override code. It wasn't hers. It came from the administrative override tied to Colonel Richard Kane's office. That code shouldn't even be active anymore, not since his retirement. But clearly someone had made sure it still worked. I stared at the numbers on the screen, the clean digital proof that someone had walked into that place and left my daughter in the dark, and I felt a cold kind of clarity settle in my chest. I walked back to the ward slowly, the kind of slow that keeps your anger from boiling over too fast. Hale was still standing in the hallway speaking with the base provost marshal. Their voices lowered when they saw me. They didn't want me hearing what they were really talking about. I knew that tone. It was the same tone Vivian used at the door, years ago. Contained. Calculated. I passed them without a word and sat down next to Ava again. She hadn't moved except for her breathing. Her lips were still pale. I reached for her hand, warm now under the thin hospital blanket, and felt the silence press in. She didn't flinch when she heard boots in the hallway, but I did. Every sound reminded me of that bunker. I could still feel the damp air clinging to my skin. My little girl had been left there for hours, not lost. Left. There was a difference, and that difference pointed to one place. Vivian had hated that she couldn't control me. Ethan had hated losing the narrative. Richard had power and the arrogance of someone who believed no one could touch him. They thought they could stage something, make it look like my negligence take Ava permanently. I leaned closer to her, breathing in the faint smell of hospital detergent and rain. She didn't speak, didn't even blink when I whispered her name. But the way her tiny hand twitched in mine told me enough. She had seen something, heard something, felt something she couldn't put into words. She was only 2, but fear leaves fingerprints even on a child that young. I left the ward at dawn and went straight to my car. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled like wet earth and iron. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring at the map of the base in my head. Jennifer Shaw, an override code from Richard Kane's office. Cameras dead. My daughter in a place no child should ever be. Hale telling me to keep quiet. I'd spent years watching how the Kane family moved. I knew how they used their connections like invisible armor, but this wasn't about weekend visitation anymore. This was about the line they had crossed when they touched my child. I drove to the east gate and parked outside the fence where the bunker lay buried. It looked harmless in daylight, just another relic of the base's Cold War history. But I could still see her small body on that concrete floor. I could still hear the sound of the hatch slamming shut. This wasn't random. This was a message. Someone wanted me to be the one blamed for this. They had expected me to be scared, cornered, grateful it hadn't ended worse. But fear is a weapon that cuts both ways. As I stood there, the wind tugging at my hair, I thought about Hale's face in the hallway, about the way the provost marshal didn't meet my eyes. They weren't confused. They were already trying to decide how to bury this. They didn't know who they were dealing with. I had spent my entire career listening, watching, keeping quiet when it served me. Now every piece of that silence was going to work for me. When I returned to the hospital, Ava was still asleep, the steady beep of the monitor the only sound in the room. I sat down and wrapped my fingers around hers. If they wanted silence to protect their image, they were about to learn what happens when they push a soldier past the edge. The Kane family had made a mistake. They had used their power in a place where I could trace every step. Jennifer Shaw, an override code, cameras off at 1900, Ava in the bunker, all of it pointed in one direction, and now I was done pretending not to see it. I parked across the street from the Kane family house and sat there for almost a full minute watching the light spilling from the kitchen window. The house looked exactly as it always had. Picture perfect. A neat front porch, white shutters, an American flag gently stirring in the breeze. Vivian liked appearances. She always had. She was the kind of woman who ironed tablecloths for Sunday brunch and made sure everyone knew she donated to the Spouses Club. She had spent years pretending to be a symbol of stability, but I knew better. Behind that carefully curated exterior was a woman who liked to control the people around her as tightly as she controlled the way her hydrangeas bloomed. I got out of the car, walked across the lawn, and knocked. She opened the door like she had been expecting me, her lips already pulling into that small smile she used when she wanted to remind me who held the upper hand. "Ember," she said smoothly. "You shouldn't be out this late. You look exhausted. You need to rest." I didn't move. Where was my daughter for 6 hours, I asked. No soft words, no polite lead-in, just the question hanging between us like a blade. Vivian's smile didn't falter, but something small flickered in her eyes. She folded her arms, leaned against the doorframe, and said it like it was nothing. "She got lost, Ember. You're overreacting. She's fine now." Her tone was calm, practiced. She had said lines like this before when she had denied me visits, when she had justified locking me out. She was used to being untouchable. I reached into my pocket and pressed the small recorder app on my phone. I had started doing this a long time ago. She didn't just get lost, I said evenly. She was found inside an abandoned bunker with the cameras cut off. That's not a coincidence. That's not a toddler wandering off. Who took her there? Vivian raised an eyebrow like I was talking nonsense. Oh, Ember, she said softly. You've always been so dramatic. You've built this whole thing up in your head. It's not good for you or for her. Let the base handle it quietly. No need to turn this into a scandal. You of all people know how that would look. When I said the word bunker out loud again, I saw it. A flicker. A stillness. It was tiny, but it was there just for half a second. She hadn't expected me to know. That was enough. She adjusted her cardigan and turned slightly as if to end the conversation, but I didn't move. Who, I asked again. She met my eyes, now the smile gone, replaced by the steel beneath. Careful, Ember. You're not the only one with something to lose. I let the silence stretch long enough for it to settle between us. Then I stepped back and said quietly, Everything we say is recorded now. Every word. Her jaw tightened. You really shouldn't do this, she said, but her voice was no longer smooth. It was brittle. She closed the door before I could say anything else. That was fine. I already had what I needed. Driving back, I played the audio once. Her reaction to the bunker wasn't loud, but it was real. She had flinched. She had tried to deflect. And for someone like Vivian, control was everything. If she flinched, it meant the truth wasn't far behind her. I walked into the hospital later that night just as a nurse adjusted the blankets around Ava. She was awake, but silent, those dark eyes fixed on the floor like she was listening to something only she could hear. I leaned down, touched her hair gently, and whispered her name. She didn't look up. Then a soldier passed in the hallway, boots hitting the tile floor with that distinct, heavy rhythm. Ava's tiny body stiffened instantly. Her hands clenched in the blanket. She didn't cry. She just froze like the sound itself was enough to hold her hostage. I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't just fear. It was recognition. She had heard those sounds in that bunker. She had memorized them. The army boots, the hard soles. Whoever left her there wasn't some stranger. It was someone from this world. Someone wearing the same uniform I wore. The next morning, Sergeant David Chin found me outside the ward drinking the kind of burnt coffee only military hospitals seem to serve. We had served together for 8 years. He was the kind of soldier who paid attention to what other people ignored. I heard about last night, he said. Word travels fast. I didn't bother to deny it. I know who had the access code, I said quietly. He didn't look surprised. He just stared at me like he was measuring the weight of the next words. CID, he said finally. You need to go to them. This isn't something you can handle alone. I know what happens when you bring something like this to CID, I said. The Kane family doesn't lose. He exhaled through his nose, leaning against the wall. They don't lose because people back down before the fight starts. Ember, I've seen what you're like when someone tells you no. So, if you're going to do this, do it right. Document everything. Don't play their game. Flip it. He was right. The Kanes had always counted on people avoiding them, but I wasn't everyone. I had spent years living in the shadow of their power. It had already cost me custody time nights listening to my daughter cry behind closed doors. But now, it was different. They had crossed into a place that even they couldn't walk back from. They had taken Ava from a safe space and placed her in a dark hole and assumed no one would ever trace it back to them. I went home that night and sat at the kitchen table with the small pile of files I had been collecting for years. Every court date, every denied visitation, every note from the daycare about sudden changes in pickup schedules. I laid it all out piece by piece. Then I added the new evidence, the security logs, the camera blackout at 1900, Jennifer Shaw's access, the override from Richard Kane's office, and now Vivian's reaction. They wanted me to feel isolated, but this wasn't isolation anymore. This was leverage. I picked up my phone, listened to the recording of Vivian's voice again. The calm surfaced the split-second crack when I mentioned the bunker. People like Vivian always leave a fracture, All you have to do is press. When I returned to the hospital the next day, Ava was sitting up a therapist, gently trying to get her to respond with simple toys. She didn't speak. She didn't even hum. But when the therapist placed a toy soldier on the bed, Ava pushed it away so hard it fell to the floor. The therapist glanced at me with that look that said everything without words. Ava wasn't just scared. She had associated the uniform itself with the terror of those hours in the bunker. I knelt beside the bed, my voice steady but low. "I promise you, baby," I whispered, "they will never hurt you again." She didn't answer, but she leaned slightly into my hand. That was enough. Chin found me later in the parking lot leaning against his truck with 2 coffees. "You made a decision," he said simply. I nodded. "I'm not reporting this to CID yet," I said. "Not officially. Not until I make sure they can't bury it. I'm going to pull the ground out from under them first." He didn't ask how. He just handed me the coffee. "You're going to burn everything down," he said quietly. "No," I corrected, looking back at the ward window where Ava's light was still on. "I'm going to make them bury themselves." The Kanes had lived in comfort for decades, moving through this base like it belonged to them. They used fear, reputation, and silence like armor. But they had forgotten something fundamental. Silence doesn't stay still. It builds pressure. It waits. And when it breaks, it doesn't whisper. It roars. That was the night I stopped playing defense. From that moment forward, every step I took was aimed at one thing: taking back everything they thought they owned, starting with my daughter's voice. I went quiet after that night, but not idle. I understood how they thought they had won, by making certain records vanish, by leaning on people who feared their name, and by treating my daughter as a pawn to be moved out of sight. So I began to collect the pieces of their story the way you collect fragments of a broken mirror until you can see a face in the shards. First, I went back to the security office at dawn and asked for the camera logs again, this time insisting on physical copies. The watch officer hesitated, then handed over a tablet and a paper printout when he realized I would not be turned away. I asked him to make an official copy and to sign beside it. He did not like that I asked for extra steps, but he complied because a sergeant asking for a record is not something you refuse. I watched every entry line by line, tracing timestamps and user IDs until late morning. The feeds around the east perimeter blacked out at the same minute across multiple systems, and the entries showed a manual override token that had been used to silence cameras in sequence. That token led to an administrative override associated with Colonel Kane's office. It should have been inactive, but someone made sure it still worked. The bunker had been opened with a legitimate card swipe timestamped, and the cameras had been darkened deliberately. Someone had cut the eyes out of the place. I needed voices as well as files. Vivian and Ethan had grown used to smiling in public and stringing softer words together when it suited them, but behind closed doors they used softer tactics with a similar purpose. I arranged for innocuous calls to be made near my kit and used a secondary device I carried in my bag that recorded line audio. Nina in CID agreed to help quietly. She was a woman who understood how to move without being seen. She set up a listening loop so that calls between Vivian and Ethan could be captured when they occurred near the channel I monitored. I was careful. We were careful. I could not afford a mistake that would feed them the narrative they wanted. At the same time, I walked the hospital paperwork like a prosecutor reading an indictment. I arranged a private meeting with Dr. Marquez, who had treated Ava that night. She was professional and careful, but she owed the child the truth. In a small locked drawer, she produced the original intake notes with timestamps, nurse initials, and chart marks that did not match the summary the command had filed. She signed an affidavit agreeing to hand over the originals if asked. Those notes confirmed exposure times and the lack of external trauma, and they matched the timeline we had from the logs. I learned to make copies in ways that could be verified: checksums for files, 2 different witnesses for signed papers, duplicates delivered to places outside the chain of command. Chin witnessed some of the handovers. He did not ask why I needed them. He only nodded when I told him to. I met with a small group of trusted civilians from the spouse community who had experience with local record keeping. They helped me duplicate printouts and place them in safe deposit boxes under aliases. I checked the digital images against the originals and made a procedural chain of custody sheet for each item. When I pulled the camera logs together, the pattern was plain. The feeds around the east perimeter blacked out at the same minute across multiple systems. That does not occur by accident. The log entry showed a manual override and a user authorization token that traced back not to a grunt or a junior NCO, but to an administrative override tied to the Kane office. That token should have been retired when Colonel Kane left base. Someone had kept it active or had reactivated it. The last recorded access to the bunker itself in the keycard log was Specialist Jennifer Shaw. She had been one of Ethan's direct subordinates before his transfer, and her duties in logistics gave her physical access to restricted storerooms with the right approvals. Jennifer did not have the authority to disable a camera feed, but she could swipe open a door. The override token that disabled the feeds matched an administrative code linked to the Kane office. When you put those two items together, a direction forms in your head like a compass needle pointing to where the wind comes from. The recordings added texture to the digital footprints. On one call, Nina captured a voice with Vivian's cadence instructing a subordinate to handle something quietly, and a second voice that sounded like Ethan offering reassurances about schedules and appearances. I listened until the words blurred, and then I played them back until I could pick out the precise clicks and pauses that betray manufactured calm. Those tiny human sounds are what break a practiced lie. Vivian had been careful, but she left a sliver of strain when I mentioned the bunker, and I had captured it. With these pieces in hand, I began to think about theatrical logic. The Kanes were a family that traded on visibility. They chose ceremonies and parades to mark themselves in the public memory, and if influence is a shield, then the wrong kind of visibility makes it brittle. Fort Liberty's 50th anniversary was on the calendar, and the program included senior leadership, several regional journalists, and a formal ceremony that would be broadcast on the base channel. It was a narrow window where influence became a liability rather than a protection. If you wanted to turn influence into exposure, a public forum where the Kanes would expect to be seen was the right place to do it. I built contingencies. I contacted a local reporter who had covered the base for years and asked broad questions about how internal investigations get handled without implying a specific accusation. I wanted to seed the idea that the system sometimes protects itself and that the right questions could open space for facts. I did not tell him about Ava. I suggested topics about transparency in internal reviews, and the reporter put a note in his pad. Nina from CID agreed to be on a narrow standby. She could not act without formal grounds, but she could be present if evidence surfaced publicly, and having her on notice was essential. Jennifer Shaw was the human variable. People below the top often fear for their livelihoods. I found a way to make it safer for her to speak if given the right opening. A friend in logistics who owed me a favor mentioned protected testimony options for those who feared retribution, and through that channel, Jennifer received an anonymous note about protections for witnesses. I did not force her hand, but I left a door ajar. Sometimes the difference between silence and speech is the sense of being seen. I also made sure the small procedural things could not be used against me. I checked that the duplicates were stamped with chain of custody marks. I carried copies of the hospital notes and disk images in a civilian bag when I traveled off base. I secured a meeting with a military lawyer who offered to review the material for procedural faults. Everything had to be bulletproof. The Kanes had weapons of influence. My weapon was proof that could be verified externally and the will to make it visible at the right moment. When the 50-year ceremony approached, I shifted into a patient waiting posture. Timing is everything. If I confronted them too early, they would close ranks. If I waited too long, they might erase what remained. I mapped the day in my head and rehearsed movements until they felt like muscle memory. I arranged for Chin and a small number of allies to be placed on event security roles, not to disrupt the ceremony, but to make sure our presence was legitimate. Nina prepared to move quickly if the evidence surfaced. The reporter had the right questions on his pad, and the civilian witnesses had copies of files in different banks. I practiced what I would say not for drama, but to make sure facts landed plainly, because facts do a different kind of harm to lies. I rehearsed lifting Ava so that she would be seen not as a symbol, but as a child. I rehearsed timing with Chin until our movements were quiet and exact. When the moment came, I wanted nothing left to chance. I would not be silent anymore, and neither would my daughter. No more. The auditorium smelled like polished wood and coffee and the faint, familiar tang of uniforms pressed for ceremony. Hundreds of faces turned toward the stage where banners commemorating 50 years of Fort Liberty hung in careful rows. I had sat through 1,000 parades and briefings in places like this, but none of them had the weight of what I carried in my arms that day. Ava was small against my chest, bundled in a soft blanket that hid the hospital wristband and the tremor that still lived under her ribs. She clung to me the way a person clings to something that is real and safe and mine. The program ran on schedule introductions and medals and the measured cadence of a history that people preferred to remember neatly. Colonel Richard Kane stood to speak his voice full of the authority that comes from a lifetime of being seen in the right rooms. He spoke of duty and legacy and the idea that some things endure if tended with care. He looked out over the crowd, and his face was the face of a man who had been given a script and learned it well. I had rehearsed this moment in my head until the words tasted like metal, not because I loved spectacle, but because I had learned that sometimes truth requires an audience. When the colonel's speech reached the bridge of its cadence, I stood. I did not announce myself in the way people expect at ceremonies. I simply stood from where I had been seated, lifted the child from my lap, and walked toward the aisle with the slow, unobtrusive step of someone who has practiced walking past people who assumed they would look away. The murmurs around me shifted like wind. People noticed, then tried to place me, then settled into curiosity. The security team flanked the stage in their formal positions, unaware that one of their own would break the script. I moved up the steps, and the lights seemed to dim for everything except the small body in my arms. My voice did not tremble when I took the microphone because shaking would have given them the excuse to turn this into hysteria. I said simply, and without flourish, "I am Sergeant Ember Collins, and this is my daughter Ava." The room made a sound like someone had taken the air from it. For a heartbeat, the colonel stopped mid-sentence and looked directly at me, the practiced mask on his face faltering like a thin plate cracking. My training had taught me to control the stage of an audience with silence. I let that stillness fill the room until the camera on the back wall caught us and the base channel began to feed the image across the internal network. People leaned forward. The broadcasted image carried a reality centimeter by centimeter into every office and home connected to that channel. I held the microphone at chest height and said the next words with the kind of quiet that forces attention because everything else either had to lean in or be left behind. My daughter was found in an abandoned bunker with the camera feeds cut off. For hours she lay in the cold. She is here now because someone heard and called it in. Then I cued the video. On the large screen behind the dais, the first clip rolled with the mechanical inevitability of truth. Camera logs time-stamped the blackout at 1900 hours. The pattern was clean and undeniable. The footage showed access logs that should have been inactive but had been engaged. The screen split, and the audio track played a clipped exchange I had kept and replayed until the cracks in it showed. Vivian Kane's voice warm and calm. The same voice that had told me that Ava was fine could be heard saying, "She got lost, do not make a scene." Then there was another clip shorter, a voice I knew without being told. Ethan Kane's tone clipped and dangerous. "If she becomes a problem, handle it quietly." The screen held the sound, and the crowd watched the faces of their leaders as recognition began to spread like ink in water. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone in the rows gasped, and the sound became a ripple that could not be smoothed. At the edge of the platform, I could see Colonel Kane's jaw tighten and feel the slow, almost ceremonial way the room tried to reconcile what it had been told to believe with the thing it could see. I did not shout. I let the facts stand like sentries between me and the polite theater of his life. The audio and the logs were simple things, sterile in their presentation, and that sterility was part of their power. Evidence does not beg for pity. Evidence asks only to be recognized. The first uniformed investigator I had invited to be on standby that day moved forward, and within moments, military police in plain clothes were at the back of the hall, their presence a discreet but irrevocable pivot. I had arranged for Nina from CID to be on notice and for Sergeant Chin to be in event security exactly where he could note things without attracting attention. He met my eyes with a small nod that said we were only beginning to scrape the surface. The lead investigator rose and announced that because of evidence presented, the internal chain of command would be temporarily suspended and that CID would be initiating a formal inquiry. The words cut through the theater like a bell. You could see the people who had profited from the illusion of control shift in their seats. I felt the collective breath of the room tighten around me and my daughter. Ava, who had not spoken since that night in the bunker, pressed her face to my shoulder and made a small sound that was not a word, but it was a life returning to itself. She reached up and touched my cheek with fingers that smelled faintly of hospital soap and a child's sweet shampoo, and the motion sent something through me that was both raw and steady. As the investigators began to move through the aisles, someone near the front stood up a man whose face I did not need to know because his reaction was human and immediate. He shouted that this was inappropriate, that a ceremony was not the place for accusation. Others echoed him. The first instinct of those who have been comfortable with a narrative when it is interrupted is to defend the narrative and to fight the messenger. But this was no accusation born of anger alone. This was a presentation of fact. I handed the microphone to the lead investigator and said nothing more than what needed to be said. Documents would be available, witnesses would be called, procedural steps would be followed. No one in the hall could now claim ignorance with veracity. The CID agents moved to the center, and in a moment that seemed to come from a different logic than the ceremony, they approached Ethan Kane, who had been sitting with the senior officers. He looked stunned in a way no rehearsal could imitate. An agent asked him to step outside to clarify a matter, and when he pulled out his phone, presumably to call his lawyer, the device was gently taken from him and retained as evidence. There is a very particular silence when the instruments of long-practiced protection begin to fail, and the silence in the hall was that kind. Mothers covered their mouths. Older soldiers held themselves very still, as if their bodies had been asked to witness an unwelcome truth. I felt the weight of it, and I felt something else, a fierce smallness that was exactly what I needed to be a mother and a soldier at once. The broadcast cut into family rooms across the base, and in some of those rooms, plates sat half-eaten and conversations stilled. The image of Ava clinging to me had an immediate, tangible effect. People posted messages to the base channel, and memos began to circulate down the chain of command. That day, I watched reputations that had felt ironclad become suddenly fragile. For all their ceremonies and honors, the base could not pretend the footage had not run. The lead investigator later told me that having the event as the venue had forced a transparency no private meeting could produce. The press might not be there in numbers, but the internal broadcast and the presence of so many witnesses ensured that any attempt to spin the story would be met with too many eyes. In the middle of all of it, Ava squeezed my hand hard enough that my own arm hurt, and for the first time since the bunker, I felt a sound from her that was hers. It was not a long sentence. It was a wet, determined noise that meant she was still here and she was with me. After the CID agents took Ethan aside and began to ask questions, there were attempts to salvage the scene. Voices attempted to shepherd people back to the program. Some senior officers whispered to one another, calculating the fallout. Others simply turned away their faces, a map of an allegiance coming into conflict with a moral line they had not chosen to cross. I stood on that stage with my daughter, and I felt the fatigue of the night sleep onto me like a weight that belonged to somebody else. The cameras clicked, the investigators recorded, and the base's internal mechanisms began to move in a way that would not be easily reversed. It did not feel like victory. It felt like justice starting a very long process. That is where I left the stage. I handed Ava to a nurse who had been waiting with a blanket and walked down the aisle with Sergeant Chin at my side. People reached for me and some offered quiet apologies. Others offered nothing. The program resumed in awkward fragments, and the day went on, but nothing about the base would be the same. If you were here in that moment, would you have held your tongue as they asked you to? Or would you have carried your truth into a theater of witnesses? Would you have stayed silent to preserve the image of an institution you trusted? Or would you have shattered that image to protect what you loved most? 1 week later, the air around my housing unit felt different, not because anything had changed outside, but because the world inside the Kane family had cracked in places they never thought could split. I had spent the past 7 days living between scheduled interviews, evidence handovers, and the quiet rebuilding of my daughter's trust. The media hadn't flooded the base because it was an internal broadcast, but the ripples were everywhere. Doors that had always opened for the Kanes now required paperwork. Voices that had once bent around them now paused before speaking. It was into this new silence that Vivian Kane appeared. I saw her through the living room window before she even reached the steps. She wasn't dressed like the woman who ran fundraisers and charity galas with practiced smiles. She was wearing a long coat too big for her thin frame, and her hands clutched a purse as if she could hold on to everything she was losing. For a second, I thought she would turn away. She didn't. She knocked softly, the kind of knock that belonged to someone begging, not demanding. I opened the door because I wasn't afraid of her anymore. She stood there with tear-stained cheeks that might have been rehearsed or real. With Vivian, it was always both. Her voice trembled just enough when she said my name. "Ember, please." I didn't invite her in. She looked past me like she wanted to find the little girl who no longer called her grandma. I stood in the doorway waiting for the pitch I knew was coming. It didn't take long. "This family has suffered enough humiliation," she said. "They're tearing us apart. Do you really want Ava growing up with all this shame around her name?" She clasped her hands like a woman in prayer. "If you pull your statement, if you let the lawyers clean this up, everything can go back to normal." I let the words hit the air between us and stay there. Normal for her meant Ava, in their hands, silence for me, and a tidy narrative for the community. My face didn't change. Her eyes searched it anyway. "We can fix this, Ember," she whispered. "You've made your point. Don't destroy everything. He's still her father." It was strange hearing that word come out of her mouth because a father doesn't leave a child in the dark. She was crying now, maybe for real. Maybe because she thought tears might soften me. It didn't matter. The cost of their cruelty had already been carved into the skin of my child. I'm not retracting anything I said. My voice was calm, like stone that had been cut to shape over time. "You can leave now." Her shoulders stiffened when she realized I meant it. "Please," she said again, but this time it came out like a command that had lost its power. She took a step closer, and I stepped forward too, not to threaten, but to make the boundary clear. "I will never let any of you near her again," I said quietly. "You burned that bridge yourselves." She turned then, something sharp slipping back into her spine, because power never dies gracefully. "You'll regret this," she hissed through her tears, and then she was gone down the steps of my porch, into a world that no longer bent around her. The next day, the base legal office informed me through my attorney that Ethan Kane had requested a meeting through his counsel. He was in a holding facility awaiting transfer to a military tribunal. His lawyer's voice over the phone was measured and too smooth. He said Ethan was prepared to offer me full custody of Ava and sign away all parental rights in exchange for me petitioning for leniency and helping reduce the charges. I sat in my kitchen listening to those words like they were the bad punchline of a cruel joke. He wanted to trade my daughter for his freedom, the same man who had used a special access badge to silence cameras and make my child disappear. Now wanted to make a deal. I didn't even let the lawyer finish. "Tell him I said I don't negotiate with people who leave children in bunkers." My attorney didn't ask me to reconsider. He had seen the photos the hospital report the broadcast. He simply said he would deliver the message and end the conversation. That night, Ava fell asleep with her head on my chest, breathing soft and even. Her hair smelled like the lavender soap from the commissary. She didn't speak yet, not fully, but she had started humming when she felt safe. It was the kind of sound that made you believe in starting over. As she slept, I thought about the woman who had stood on my porch crying and the man sitting in a cell trying to barter. They had spent their lives believing power meant ownership. What they didn't understand was that their control had only ever existed because I allowed it to. Now they were learning what happens when that permission is revoked. The official notification came 2 days later. Vivian Kane was formally barred from entering Fort Liberty property pending the outcome of the investigation. Her name, once whispered like a guarantee of influence, now appeared on the restricted access list like any other civilian under review. A military police officer served her with the paperwork at the edge of the gate. She didn't try to enter again. Meanwhile, Ethan Kane was moved from the holding cell to the facility that processed pretrial hearings for serious offenses. The list of charges had grown as the investigation dug through his record abuse of security access, child endangerment, obstruction. The words sounded clinical on paper, but each of them represented something brutal and personal. Reporters had begun to call the base public affairs line, not for official statements, but because stories like this travel even without press releases. Families whispered at the commissary, soldiers lowered their voices in the mess hall. Everyone had an opinion. I didn't need to defend myself. The evidence spoke louder than gossip. The legal machinery of the military moves slowly, but with precision once it's forced to engage. What happened at that ceremony couldn't be swept under a rug. There had been too many eyes. Vivian had thought her tears might undo what the facts had carved in stone. Ethan had thought his offer would tempt me to bend. Neither understood that I had crossed the line where mercy and compromise no longer lived. I visited the training field at sunrise, the place where everything in my life used to be simple muscle and movement. Chin found me there doing laps. He didn't say anything at first. He just jogged beside me until we reached the edge of the track. "They're scrambling," he said finally. "Vivian's trying to call in favors, but no one wants to burn themselves for her." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. "They'll keep trying to twist this," he added. "They always do, but this time they're cornered." I nodded, breathing steadily. They took everything from me once I said, "I'm not giving them another inch." The next morning, the CID investigator handling the case briefed me on the upcoming military tribunal. Ethan's team had floated multiple offers behind closed doors, hoping to soften the proceedings. None of them mattered. The case wasn't mine to drop anymore. It belonged to the system that he had tried to manipulate. When they told me he looked shaken at the mention of federal charges, I didn't smile, I didn't celebrate. I just felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing the story would not be rewritten to paint me as unstable or desperate as they had tried to do for years. Vivian tried one last time. She sent a letter hand-delivered through a neighbor who didn't know better. It was 3 pages long, written in that looping handwriting of hers, trying to sound maternal and broken at the same time. She said things like, "Ava belongs with family," and "We can fix this if you meet me halfway." She ended with a line about legacy, how the Kane name should not be dragged through the mud by bitterness. I read it once, folded it neatly, and put it in the shredder. The truth is, I didn't need their apologies. I didn't need their offers. I had my daughter. I had the truth. And I had the power of a system that finally, begrudgingly, had to face its own reflection. The Kane family had spent decades playing the game as if they were the board itself. But I had found the weak joint the moment where all their influence cracked under the weight of one undeniable fact: a child had been left in the dark, and I was her mother. When I put Ava to bed that night, she wrapped her little arms around my neck in that clumsy toddler way that almost chokes you, but makes you feel like the world has narrowed to the heartbeat against your chest. I whispered to her that we were safe. Now that no one could take her away again, that the darkness they tried to bury her in belonged to them, now not to us. Outside, the night air smelled like pine and rain. Inside my chest, it smelled like victory. Not the loud kind that fills stadiums. The quiet, unshakable kind that belongs to survivors who decided not to bow anymore. The day the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent in that particular way. Only military tribunals can be sterile and heavy with the weight of rank and history pressing down on every seat. Ethan sat in his uniform, the same one he used to wear, with the arrogance of someone who believed it was a shield. He looked thinner now. Smaller somehow, like a man whose armor had been stripped long before the judge's voice echoed through the room. The list of charges sounded clinical, even detached, but each line landed with the precision of a blade. Abuse of security access, child endangerment, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to falsify base records. The judge's voice did not waver, and for once neither did mine. I sat in the gallery, not hiding, not breaking, just listening as the system he had relied on finally turned its eyes on him. The sentence came cleanly: dishonorable discharge, revocation of benefits, and 10 years in federal custody. 10 years is not a lifetime, but it is enough time for someone to realize that power can't save you once the walls of your world collapse inward. Ethan's lawyer tried to argue for leniency, but there was no room left. The evidence had been overwhelming and, more importantly, public. You cannot erase what hundreds of witnesses saw and heard on that stage. You cannot bury a child's silence beneath a flag and call it honor. Vivian's case moved through the civilian system, but with the same cold inevitability. She was indicted on charges of obstruction and defamation after investigators found clear records of her interference during the early hours of the search and her attempts to discredit me in formal statements. She had used her influence like a scalpel for years, cutting and reshaping narratives to protect her family. But this time, the blade turned on her. When the charges were read, she didn't look at me, but I saw the moment her hands tightened on the table, as if she could hold on to a world that no longer answered to her. The officers who had looked the other way, men who had shrugged off the missing footage, who had accepted closed-door conversations as fact, found their careers ending quietly in the weeks that followed. A few were demoted, others forced into early retirement. Some faced disciplinary hearings of their own. It wasn't because they had touched the crime directly, but because silence has fingerprints too. For years, the Kane name had wrapped itself around the command like an untouchable myth. That myth cracked the moment truth echoed through that hall. CID released a formal report 3 weeks after the verdict, a thick binder of procedural failures and security recommendations. They outlined the vulnerabilities that allowed someone to disable camera systems with outdated administrative codes and the lack of oversight that had made it possible for the Kane family to exploit the base's trust. The recommendations were clear: updated clearance protocols, independent review boards for sensitive cases, removal of legacy overrides, and mandatory reporting chains that could not be overridden by rank or influence. My daughter's suffering had forced an entire system to look at itself in the mirror. Fort Liberty became a case study for national security training, not because it was proud of what happened, but because it couldn't ignore it anymore. Command briefings across other installations referenced the event, turning the nightmare I lived through into a textbook for what not to allow. My name was mentioned in those briefings not as a soldier to be pitied, but as the person who stood when others stayed quiet. When the paperwork was signed, granting me full legal and physical custody of Ava, there were no courtroom cheers, no triumphant music, just a slow, quiet release of something I'd been carrying for years. The Kane name no longer had legal claim to her. She was mine. The base offered me a new assignment after the trial, a position as an internal security instructor. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady grounded and allowed me to stay close to Ava. I accepted not out of ambition, but because it meant I could turn the pain of what had happened into something that would protect someone else's child. The first day I walked into that new office, the walls still smelled like fresh paint, and my nameplate was clean and sharp against the door. I stood there for a moment, remembering the woman I had been months before, the one who felt powerless watching her daughter through a window, and the woman who now stood with no one's permission needed. Ava's recovery was slower. Trauma doesn't move at the speed of legal documents. For weeks, she still woke up crying at odd hours, clutching the blanket I'd wrapped around her that night at the bunker. She flinched at certain sounds: boots on the floor, the hydraulic hiss of heavy doors, but little by little those edges began to dull. Therapy sessions were long and quiet, filled with soft toys, gentle voices, and patient repetition. Then, one rainy afternoon, as I laced my boots near the door, I heard a sound I hadn't heard in months. She said, "Mama." Just one word. Small, cracked at the edges like something rebuilt from ash. I froze mid-motion, my hands tightening against the laces as if moving too quickly would scare it away. She was standing near the couch in her little yellow sweater, her curls messy from the nap. She looked at me with those same wide eyes she had in the bunker, but now they held something different, something alive. I knelt, and she ran into my arms with the clumsy confidence of a child who had fought her way back to her own voice. Every fight, every hearing, every night I'd sat awake listening to her silent breathing felt like it existed for that moment. The base still whispered about the Kane scandal. Soldiers still told the story in the dining hall. Recruits still passed it around during night watch. But for me, it wasn't a story. It was blood and bone and the sound of my daughter's voice clawing its way back through the dark. I started my work with CID's training program with a single directive: no one should ever be able to bury evidence behind a last name again. I built scenarios from the case stripped of names, but not of their lessons. I stood in front of rooms filled with officers and NCOs and told them the truth with the calm of someone who no longer feared their power. People often think justice is loud, but it isn't. It's a steady sound, the kind that hums beneath everything else. It's Ethan sitting in a cell where no special badge can open a door. It's Vivian barred from the gates she used to stroll through like a queen. It's the command rewriting protocols they thought were untouchable. And it's Ava saying mama in a house where no one can take her away again. There are still nights when the memory comes back sharp, the bunker, the silence, the cold. But when it does, I look at my daughter and I remember that the same silence they tried to weaponize became the very thing that destroyed them, because I broke it. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a soft voice returning after months of fear, and sometimes that's enough to make the whole world shift. The morning air on the Fort Liberty training field is the kind that lingers against your skin, crisp and quiet, the kind that carries every sound a little farther than usual. The sun is low, spilling gold across the worn asphalt, and the painted white lines lighting up the edges of the world like the day is deliberately starting slower than everyone else. I stand at the edge of the track with my hands tucked into the pockets of my jacket, watching Ava chase the wind. She's wearing her little yellow sweater, the one she insists on every morning now, her curls catching the light as she runs. Her laughter cuts through the silence like a signal flare, bright and full and alive. It's the kind of sound I used to imagine during the sleepless nights when the darkness of that bunker haunted every breath I took. She trips over a line and bursts into giggles before she even hits the ground. She doesn't flinch at the sound of boots on the pavement anymore. A group of soldiers jogs past on their morning PT, run their cadence echoing through the open field. For a moment, my body tenses out of old habit, waiting for her to freeze like she used to. She doesn't. She just turns her head, watches them with curious eyes, and then keeps running toward the light. That tiny moment means more to me than any medal they could ever pin on my chest. The base has changed. Some of those changes are written in policy binders and CID reports in new clearance protocols and oversight measures that were born from the nightmare I lived through. Others are quieter, written into the way people glance when they see me, the way their conversations lower when they speak of the Kane name, the way some officers now walk a little straighter when they think about what silence can cost. The story became bigger than me the day I stepped onto that stage. But here, in this soft morning, it's just me and my daughter. I close my eyes for a second and let the cool air fill my lungs. There are still scars, some I carry on the inside, some she carries in places no child should ever have to. Justice doesn't erase damage, it just stops it from spreading. There will be years of small steps therapy sessions, moments where the past tries to press its weight into the present. But the bunker didn't win. The silence didn't win. People still stop me sometimes on base. A sergeant once pressed his hand against his chest and said quietly, "Thank you for what you did." A young private told me she watched the broadcast from her barracks room and cried. I don't think of myself as a hero. I think of myself as a mother who refused to let her child be buried under someone else's power. The Kane family name has become a cautionary tale. Ethan is serving his sentence in federal custody, stripped of rank, stripped of the uniform he used as a shield. Vivian's voice no longer carries weight here. Those who once spoke for them have learned to lower their eyes. The fortress they thought they built around themselves was just smoke held together by silence. The moment I broke that silence, their power scattered like ash in the wind. I accepted the position as a security instructor because I wanted to turn pain into something useful. My classroom isn't a traditional one. It's built on the blunt reality of what happens when people let influence eclipse duty. I stand in front of soldiers, young old hardened green, and tell them not a legend, not a speech, but the truth. I tell them how a child nearly disappeared because people feared a last name more than they respected their oath. Some of them shift uncomfortably. Good. Truth should make people uncomfortable. That's how it sticks. On the far side of the field, Ava slows down and looks over at me with a grin so wide it catches me off guard. She waves both arms like she wants the whole world to see her. For a long time, I worried that her world would be permanently shaped by fear. But kids are different from us. They know how to grow toward light. She's living proof that resilience isn't loud. It's the quiet persistence of something refusing to break. I kneel down as she runs toward me, her small sneakers tapping against the pavement in uneven rhythm. She barrels into my arms like she always does, a little clumsy, a little wild. I lift her easily, her warmth pressing against me, her breath fast from running. She wraps her arms around my neck and presses her face against my cheek. She whispers something soft, just one word, Mama, but it's enough to steady the world. For months, I carried rage like it was the only thing keeping me upright. Now in this morning light, it's something else entirely. Not peace. Peace feels too distant, too clean, but steadiness. A quiet, anchored strength that can't be taken away. They tried to erase me through my child. Instead, my child became the reason their power fell apart. I walk with her down the track, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, the air filling with the sound of other soldiers' training whistles blowing orders being called out. Life continues. Bases don't stop. Armies don't pause for one woman's fight. But somewhere in the records of this place, there's a case file that bears my name and hers. There's a policy that exists because a 2-year-old was left in the dark and lived to see the light. There are people who ask me why I went public, why I didn't just go through the quiet channels, handle it the way military families are told to. I don't always answer them directly. I just tell them this: when the system protects the powerful instead of the innocent, silence is not loyalty, it's complicity. I chose to be loud. I chose to be seen. And in doing so, I forced them to see my daughter too. Ava slips out of my arms and tugs my hand toward the swing set on the edge of the field. She doesn't say much yet, but she doesn't need to. Every step she takes is a sentence written louder than anything I could say. She climbs into the swing and I push her gently, the wind catching her hair as she laughs again. I think of all the nights I held her in the hospital, afraid the silence would never leave her body. That sound now, the laugh, is the truest victory I will ever have. I know what people will remember of me isn't medals or rank. It will be the moment I stepped onto that stage with her in my arms and refused to be quiet. It will be the sound of a system cracking under the weight of its own denial. It will be the knowledge that no matter how powerful a family believes they are, they cannot bury the truth forever. I watch the sky slowly brighten. The flag at the far end of the field lifts in the wind, snapping against the pole. I think of all the things that flag has meant to different people and what it means to me now. Not blind loyalty, not silence. It means standing up when it matters, even when the people around you tell you to sit down. I kneel in the damp grass beside the swing brush, a stray curl from Ava's forehead, and whisper the words that have lived inside me since the night I pulled her from the cold concrete of that bunker. No one has the right to use power to bury a child in darkness, not ever again. She doesn't fully understand the words, not yet. But one day she will, and when she does, she'll know her mother didn't just fight for her, she fought to make sure no one else's child would be left in the dark like that. So I ask you, whoever is listening, whoever has carried your own silence like a weight when the moment comes, will you keep quiet as they ask, or will you stand up for the ones you love? Leave your thoughts below. Some silences are meant to be broken.